Ouvinte Gregario, hoje nós temos um convidado muito especial. Nicolas e muitos atletas de endurance tiveram insights preciosos do How Bad Do You Want It? Quão duro você deseja? É um livro de 2015 que ainda não existe em português, mas quem puder ler em inglês eu recomendo fortemente. E nós temos com hoje o Matt Fitzgerald. O Matt começou a fazer maratonas aos 11 anos de idade, na maratona de Boston, de 83, com o pai dele. Já tem mais de 50 maratonas, mais de 20 livros escritos. Foi um dos colaboradores do nascimento da revista Triathlete. Escreveu para praticamente tudo que você pode imaginar sobre esporte, bicycling, outside. Mais de 20 livros publicados. É um nutricionista, é um atleta, é um escritor. A gente pode dizer que o Matt é uma pessoa que achou como viver do esporte no esporte e generosamente escrevendo os livros e dando conhecimento. Inclusive 80-20 é um livro clássico, também eu recomendo ler, sobre estratégia de treino e quanto muita gente treina aquela zona morta que não é nem fraco nem forte, e ele recomenda 80% de baixa de intensidade e 20% a média alta intensidade. É outro livro fantástico. Esse programa será em inglês e futuramente nós vamos fazer uma sequência de comentários ajudando a você que não esteja tão fluido no inglês. E com isso a gente muda a tecla SAP aqui. Matt, it's a great honor to have you at Gregario after the brief introduction in Portuguese. Your list of achievements with more than 50 marathons since 83, more than 20 books. You had achieved what very few people do, which is doing what you love in running, and then providing help as a coach, as a writer, as a columnist. And it was a great privilege that we were able to connect through Instagram, thanks to the digital community, and have you with us here with Gregario.
Yes, thank you so much for reaching out. It's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to both of you.
And I'm going to start with a mention on your last book, which is The Importance of Pacing and Pacing as an Art, and I think connects with all your books, that says that in order to achieve great results, you have to learn how to keep your pain tank filled. Can you elaborate on that passage of your most recent book?
Certainly. What makes endurance sports different from many, if not most, other sports is that the limits that endurance athletes encounter, especially in competition, are not really physiological in nature. They're perceptual in nature. Any endurance athlete with any amount of experience knows that the goal of any race is to cover the distance from the start to the finish as quickly as possible. But because of the distances involved, you cannot swim or bicycle or run at maximal effort at any point, whether it's, even like a 5K running event or, a 20-kilometer cycling time trial, or a 1,500 meter pool swim. If you are producing a maximal effort, that is only sustainable for about 30 seconds, even if you're very, very well trained. So you're deliberately holding yourself back. You're deliberately restraining yourself, or the word we use for it in English is pacing. You're pacing yourself. So that means that by definition you could go faster. At almost any point in any type of endurance race, you are voluntarily not going as fast as you can, but you have to do that in order to achieve the greater goal of reaching the finish as quickly as possible. So obviously, it may sound as if I'm suggesting that we never do actually encounter any kind of limit in endurance racing, and that's not the case. We do have a limit. That's why we don't go faster than we do. But that limit is not physiological unless we make a mistake with our pacing and we go too fast too early. The limit we encounter is perceptual, and it's real, but it's different than our physiological limits. If you run out of glycogen fuel in your muscles and liver, that's the equivalent of running out of petrol in a motor vehicle. It's a hard physical limit. There's nothing you can do about it. That seldom actually happens during an endurance race. The limit we encounter is a limit of perceived effort, which is the discomfort that we experience when we're exerting ourselves against fatigue. And that limit, although real, is mutable. We can move it, but it is not pain, but it's very similar to pain. So when you hit that limit, it really is very similar to running out of fuel, where you can't do any more. You're done.
When we look at your career, you've begun as an athlete. you've been a runner itself. You've then went on to work mainly as a coach and nutritionist. And then in the recent past, let's say in the past 10 years or so, you've kind of moved more into this side of the psychological, mental side of barriers and breaking the limits. How did this curiosity on you to switch from traditional physiology to stay within nutrition, training, as Alvaro mentioned, 28 polarized training. You have plenty of books on nutrition and strategies as well for endurance athletes. And then recently you have, we've seen that you've kind of moved more into this psychobiological. I don't know, how would you like to put a term for this specific work that you do? How did this happen?
I've been fascinated with the psychological dimension of endurance sports since the very first experience I had with an endurance race. I was I think 11 years old, 10 or 11 years old, when my school had field day, and it was like, just a bunch of competitions for the kids to participate in. And I chose to participate in a running race that was usually young kids. When they race, they sprint, right? They will go a short distance. But this one was, I think, 2 laps around a soccer pitch. So maybe about 800 meters or so. And I had never tried to race over such a distance before. And I remember, distinctly, this is a very, very long time ago, but I remember being shocked by how painful it was and how I could keep going despite feeling, a kind of discomfort that was more intense and just different than anything I'd never known before. I ended up winning that race. And I felt like that what allowed me to do it was my willingness and ability to tolerate the discomfort I was experiencing. It wasn't necessarily because I was faster or fitter than the other runners. So, I've had I had that insight in my very first endurance race. And so I've always been interested in it. And a little bit later, when I was in secondary school, the high school age here in the US, I was running competitively for my school teams. And I became what we call a head case in English, where I had a bad reaction to the pain of racing. And I started to underperform and actually quit running for close to 10 years. And I didn't think I would get back into it. And I only got back into it in my later 20s. And when I did, I wanted to overcome being a head case. I wanted to learn how to embrace the discomfort of racing in a way that I had not been able to when I was younger. So that's always been, it's very personal for me. My real limitation, my weakness was mental.
You mentioned that when your father, who was a jogger on his words, and you started running, he used a very early stage pedometer. Over the last decades, we had a lot of tools to measure watts on a bicycle or even watts when running or swimming. And this compares with perceived level of effort, which you're a strong advocate that this is the ultimate gauge to measure. But one needs a learning curve or listening to your body and understanding the difference between a killing pain and a growing pain. On your experience, how does this evolution works where your perceived effort is a stronger tool to be complemented with other tools that you can achieve to measure your watts, your energy, you spending heart rates and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I started running, most of those tools did not exist. I mean, even commercial heart rate monitors they existed, but nobody had them back then. So, in those days, if you were a runner or a cyclist, you had to go by perceived effort. My father, he would measure his training routes in his car. He would get in a car and drive. And, if he wanted a 6-mile run route, he would drive 3 miles from home and just look around and say, oh, okay, well, there's a tree. The tree is the 3-mile mark. That's where I'll turn around. And then, when you went and ran, I remember I would wear, a sports watch that told me how long I'd been running, but that was it. And so I was forced to learn how to pace myself, how to find my limits by feel. And the goal of every endurance athlete is to find your limit in competition. You don't want to walk away and say, you know what, I could have done better if I had tried harder, if I had paced myself better. And the only way you can get there is to become a master of reading your own perception of effort. The tools that now exist, the heart rate monitors and power meters and speed and distance devices for runners, they can be very helpful in cultivating that ability to read one's perceptions. But like any tool, they can become a crutch and actually start to inhibit the process. And what happens is if you don't have experience as an endurance athlete, and from the very first day you start training, you're relying on one of these devices. As a coach, I see it. It's a much slower process because we're all lazy mentally. Like if there's a tool that can do the job for us, we will tend to rely on that tool.
And on the coaching side, the importance is it's very hard for one to perfect by himself. You have somebody else watching you or recording images of you so you can learn and understand what you're doing wrong and correct it. And not only doing the planning of the season and the level of exercise and intensity, but rather how your body is performing. And thus read your body with you and say, trust me, you still can go further. Trust me, you still can push a little harder.
Right. Yes. Most of the time you're actually doing the opposite. You're pulling athletes back. You're asking them to exercise restraint. But either way, you're asking them just to be more mindful and aware about what they're doing and what is my goal for this session and how do I distribute my effort optimally to achieve that goal. So, for example, in competition, for sure, you are trying to push back your limit. But in training, that's very seldom the case. So what I find myself doing very often with athletes, and I coach mostly runners, is, I'm thinking of one athlete in particular I started working with recently where he had a tendency to, if I gave him a set of intervals to do, he would treat them as a maximal effort, almost as if it were a race. And he was often slowing down by the time he got to his last interval. So I said, here's the rule. From now on, whenever I give you an interval workout, your last interval has to be your fastest one. And so that just helped him. That little rule helped him sort of like break out of that habit and start thinking ahead. So it's easy when your coach says do 12 times 1 minute, you're thinking about the first interval when you're doing the first interval. But what you should be thinking about is the 12th interval when you're doing the first one. You have to think ahead and view and understand the task as a whole. And that just starts the process of step by step. It doesn't happen overnight.
And I think this reminds me, again, a passage of your latest book where you narrate the 2019 Berlin Marathon, where two elite runners, and one of them, his goal pace was not as fast as the other one, but he was disciplined enough on his own pace and has some reserve to, by the end, win the race, even coming very, very close, 0.02% of the world record at that time, and which is critical because a lot of people, when they say, well, I'm about to finish, they kind of start to shut down, where actually you have to train your mind only to shut down after you cross the line. And until then, you push into maximum effort to the best you can do. And I think that makes a difference between a podium and just completing the race.
Yes. Yeah. And, that example shows just how good you can get at pacing. There's a tendency, because pacing doesn't really look like a skill. If you see two runners and one happens to be pacing himself perfectly in a marathon, and the other one is going too fast and he's going to fall apart later on and end up walking before he reaches the finish line. You visibly watching these runners, you can't tell the difference. You can't tell which one is pacing well. They just both look like they're running, which makes it very deceptive compared to other sports. Take the example take a sport like tennis, where the skill of the highest players is just so obvious. When you see them, dive to hit a volley and it clears the net by that much and grazes the line and it's a winner for that player. That you couldn't step onto a tennis court and accidentally do that yourself. That it is a skill that requires a lot of talent and then a lot of practice as well. Well, pacing is really the same. It doesn't look the same, but the athletes who do it the best are just as good as those tennis players who do things that make our jaws fall open when we watch them on television. I mean, think about it. Like, as I say in the book, a marathon is a race of about 55,000 steps for the average runner. And in order to finish a marathon in the least time possible, every single one of those 55,000 steps has to contribute toward, they can't be wasted. They can't be too fast or too slow. There's a little bit of wiggle room, but you have to be extremely precise in order to truly finish a marathon in the least time possible, or any other endurance race. And yeah, I mean, your limit is literally, 1 second, one side or the other. And it takes a long time to get to the point when you can finish a race and say, I know I couldn't have gone any faster than that.
That being said, but taking a little bit to the other side, back a little bit to the pain threshold, let's say, and how long you are able to walk in that goal line, as you said in the book. We can clearly identify that big athletes and big champions, they are capable and they have perhaps a pain threshold higher than the others. And they are capable of sustaining that pain via pacing or via whatever better than others. That's the main theory behind it. The question is that trainable, that capacity of sustaining pain for a longer period?
Yes, it is. And I mean, that is the scientific answer to that question. Studies have shown that it is trainable. But I also know from experience, you will recall my saying earlier in the interview that I had a poor tolerance for that discomfort when I was younger, and I completely transformed. I worked on it for a long time, but by the time I was in my later 30s, early 40s, I actually craved that pain. Like, it was almost like a drug for me. It was my favorite part of every race when it became extremely painful, because I knew I was good at it. and I knew I was better at that than the athletes around me. And that was my chance to shine. I didn't have the highest VO2 max, but I felt I did have the highest tolerance for the pain. And that is so far away from where I started off.
My next question would be, indeed, how can we train it? Is there a technique? Are there tricks that we can use and practice? Or any sort of, we see a lot in the neuroscientist world nowadays. We talk a lot about brain training. Samuel, as you mentioned, is one of the motors behind it, and plenty of people who work with him that are trying to develop ways, perhaps training those capacities, right?
Yes. I think actually the most powerful way to improve that capacity is intention, which is so many athletes, when if I ask a room full of 100 athletes, are you as tough as you want to be? Like, do you feel like you're really good at handling the discomfort of racing? Most of those athletes would say, no, I'm not that good at it. I could be better, because I've actually done this before. So most athletes recognize that they have room to improve. But then if I ask another question, okay, what are you doing about it? You've said that you could improve in this area. What are you doing? And the honest answer would be, I'm just sort of hoping it happens. They want it to happen, but they're not actually doing anything about it. And what was different in my case is that it became my number one primary goal as an athlete. When I started running again in my 20s, I would judge my performance in races not by my time or my finishing position, but by how much I was willing to suffer. And it didn't matter if I won the race or ran a personal best time. If I knew I could have gone harder, I chastised myself for it. Now, that might be a slightly unsatisfying answer, but it's true. And it's actually sort of good news, because all you have to do is just have the intention, and you've gotten started. You can try little experiments. This works in shorter races, where you can actually intentionally go too fast and just see what happens when you reach your limit before you've gotten to the finish line, and just try to hang on as best you can. Like, I had a coach when I was younger who told me, we were having a conversation about this. He said one thing he did once is he went to the track and he started running as fast as he could, an all-out sprint. And he just kept going until he dropped. He was just going slower and slower and slower, and it hurt more and more and more, but he just kept going until he literally couldn't. his attitude was, well, that was terrible, but nothing can feel any worse than that. And I've done it. And it helped him going forward. It's like, the pain has already done the worst it can to me. How bad can it be going forward?
Matt, we've heard that many people that produce culture, knowledge, such as yourself, start with a question that you want to answer and a challenge you pose yourself. In the case of How Bad We Want It, that was published in 2015, you clearly stepped out of your comfort zone, let's say, on exploring 12 different sports and understanding the how bad do you want it for each of those sports, and picking up great examples on persons that because of their mind, they achieved greater results than their body could be. The question is, how was the journey for you? What did you take out on producing the book, on writing the book, on researching for the book?
Yes, in addition to being an athlete and a coach and someone who writes about endurance sports, I'm also a fan of endurance sports. I like watching the world's best endurance athletes compete. I appreciate what their performance is. And this has been the case since I was a young boy. And so over the years, I've sort of collected these stories. They're almost like works of art. Some of the comebacks that great athletes achieve, or the barriers they're able to break, and they're wonderful, powerful stories. And I think they're even more powerful if you understand that they're achieved by human beings, not superheroes. One of the advantages of being a journalist is, I've had opportunities to get to know elite endurance athletes personally. And you actually appreciate their achievements more when you realize that they have fears and doubts, just like the rest of us. So that was part of my mission for that book, is to get people to get other athletes to see and appreciate and understand the greatest athletes the same way I did, as remarkable, but also relatable, for athletes to see these stories and say, you know what? I could do something like that. I can't go as fast, but I could be that brave or that strong or that resilient. So that was part of it. And then the other thing is, I write a lot about science, obviously, in my work, but I am not a scientist. I don't have scientific training. So for me, stories, real world stories, help illustrate the science. That's what I'm doing in each one of those chapters. I'm making some type of scientific argument, not based on my own research, but based on others. And then I'm illustrating it through the story of a real athlete. And I just think it helps ground the science and make it easier to understand if you are not highly scientifically literate, as I am not.
But when you were describing that, I wonder, is there any athlete or anybody in special who really marked you, really change it when you were producing that and having the opportunity to be with them, that you really remember and say, damn, this guy or girl, whoever, really has something?
There are a lot of these people, and they're remarkable in slightly different ways. There's one in actually not in that book, but in a later book I wrote called The Comeback Quotient, which is very similar. It's a very similar approach. And I tell the story in there of a triathlete named Jamie Whitmore. She was an off-road triathlete. So she did, it's like rough water swim, mountain biking, trail running triathlons. And she was a world champion in the 1990s in that. And then she got cancer. And it was, she almost died. She had, major surgeries, and she was never the same. She didn't fully recover, but she still came back to the best of her ability and started competing in Paralympic cycling, and ended up winning a gold medal in Rio in cycling in the Paralympic Games. And so she went from being an able-bodied world champion in one endurance sport to a Paralympic gold medalist in another sport after going through, I describe what she went through with her cancer ordeal in kind of gory detail, because I want people to understand how deeply she suffered and for how long. And so that's one that really stands out, because sometimes it's one thing if an athlete has like a major setback within the sport, but when it's a life setback that transcends sport, and it really is sort of a life or death type of catastrophe that has befallen an athlete, and to see how the mentally strongest among them are able to overcome that type of setback it's really humbling.
Matt, there's another book from Angela Duckworth, Grit, that actually has a broader range and even a quick test you can do on the internet. How do you think this concept connects with the psychophysiology?
Well, I mean, there's a great deal of overlap. I will say it's easy to think that, the ability to tolerate or to master perception of effort in endurance sports is all about grit, but it's really not. There's more to it than that. Like part of it, and I stress this in my book on pacing, like part of it is actually just body awareness, being able to knowing your body and being able to read and understand your body. Because, sometimes when we fail to achieve our limit in a race, it's not because we're afraid or we lack grit. It's because we don't know what our limit is. We don't know, because you really have to find it by feel. And so, there are many different facets to it. And so grit is, and there's a million other words for it, toughness, resilience, what have you. It's important, but I almost feel it gets too much attention and that it overshadows some of the other elements that are important to, mastering perception of effort, as I phrase it.
Such as?
Go back to the example from On Pace, where I talk about I describe the 2019 Berlin Marathon and that decisive moment later in the race when one of the runners made a surge and Kenenisa Bekele, who was, considered the best runner in the race, he failed to answer the surge. So when I was watching the race, I thought he was going to lose. I thought he needed to go. He needed to answer that surge. And the only reason he didn't, the only possible reason he didn't was because he couldn't. But he ended up Bekele ended up coming back and actually winning the race, surprising many observers. And afterwards, at a press conference after the race, he explained that when the other runner surged, he tried to go with him, but he felt a twinge in his hamstring muscle. And because he was very experienced and he had great body awareness, he decided, he probably, like every instinct in him was saying, you have to go anyway, you have to do it anyway. But he decided to, and it wasn't that he was giving up, he still wanted to win, but he thought, you know what, I think it's a bad idea if I try to run at that pace right now. I think I might injure my hamstring. So he waited. He didn't slow down, and his attitude was, I'll limit the damage. I'll keep him within sight and hope that he overcooks himself, that he is going too hard too early. And that's exactly what happened. The other runner, the leader, slowed down. Bekele was able to just sense that his hamstring was okay and speed up a little bit. So that's the sort of thing I'm talking about where, yeah, grit is important. You have to be able to, just to tolerate a high level of suffering. But you also, and this is just one example of something else that's involved in the formula, just like knowing how to read what you're feeling, like knowing what your body is telling you is another huge piece of it.
And this is a good example of the maturity of an athlete, that in a less mature situation, one would just push and maybe not even finish the race. And here the maturity say, this is the best I can do. I'm going to play my cards and hope there's some opportunity for me, which happened, but it could have not. And I think with the how bad do you want it, there's also your maturity on your perceived effort, understanding your limits, and that beyond those limits, you'll be hurting yourself and not winning much. And maybe sometimes making the tough call of just quitting to win future races.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, there's a scientific term for what our brains or what our minds are doing in these situations. And in English, it's inhibitory control. Another word for it would be more, in common language, restraint. And what's interesting about it is that it can operate in both directions. So inhibitory control comes into play anytime your mind is divided and you want two things that are contradictory and incompatible at the same time. So, the common scenario in endurance sports that when we think of inhibitory control being exercised, it's when you're in a race and you're beginning to suffer and your instincts are telling you, slow down, quit, But another part of you doesn't want to slow down or quit. Another part of you wants to resist the discomfort you're experiencing and continue to do the best you can and get to the finish line as quickly as possible. So inhibitory control helps you resist the impulse to slow down in the service of a greater goal. But it can also work the other way around, like almost completely the opposite when, and we'll go back to the example of Bekele, where when the other runner surged and he wanted to surge with him, his impulse was, I have to go. But he used inhibitory control or restraint to resist that. And so it's flipped around. Sometimes you need it to push when something is in you is telling you to quit. And sometimes you need to use the same mechanism to resist pushing when your common sense tells you it's a bad idea.